Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chairman of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. This is the first monthly presentation on the global monetary outlook for 2021. 2020 was, of course, the year of the coronavirus epidemic, with the collapse in output in the second quarter as governments responded to the medical emergency by lockdowns and restricting output and so on. And the associated with the epidemic was a very big debate in economics between those who thought that the sequel to the epidemic would be deflation and those who, on the contrary, said there was going to be more inflation. Now, today's talk is very much on the inflation-deflation debate. You'll be aware that throughout this, I have taken the view that the result of the epidemic would be inflationary in the medium term. And I took that view very much because of the policy response to the medical news. Essentially, governments widened their budget deficits and they financed these deficits from central banks and banking systems, commercial banks, and the result was faster monetary growth. This was then topped up by asset purchases by central banks, so-called quantitative easing, and the result was a rapid acceleration of money growth. And in my view, that was bound to be inflationary. Now, for much of last year, the end of last year, we focused on the impact of money on asset prices. Essentially, a lot of money around will tend to push up share prices and other asset prices too. And this was all part of the argument that the medium-term implications of the epidemic were going to be inflationary. Today, I'm going to be focusing on commodity prices. This is the first chart. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about this index. It's an index of commodity prices. It's an index, it's the level of the index. It covers the 2010s. You can see that it's been lower in recent years than in the early 2010s. You can see the big dip in early 2010 and then a recovery. And I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. What I emphasize at this point is that this is a very well-constructed representative index. It is intended to match the pattern of the world economy in terms of the relative importance of the components of the index. Oil and gas are about 60% of the index, which roughly matches their importance in the world economy. They are around about spending on oil gas is around about 4 or 5% of world GDP, depending on the oil price, of course. But and then the other components of the index are two types of food, livestock and arable products. They're about 25% of the index, and then there's metals. So this index matches pretty well the relative importance of commodities and to world output, and then the impact of commodity prices on costs in general. Okay, obviously many types of product. The key cost is the cost of the inputs, and much of the inputs are energy, commodities, and so on. What I've done here is to translate that index of the levels into rates of change, where I've assumed we're taking 6-month periods and we annualize it. Okay. We assume that what's happened in that 6 months carries on for a full year. And it shows a 6-month annualized rate of change for the 2010s for this particular index. Now, what's happening at the end is amazing, and it is actually that increase in the last 6 months is unprecedented in the 2010s. I suspect it's unprecedented in the history of this index going back to the early 1990s. The increase in this index to the middle of January, which is the last date here, 15th of January, was 87%, which annualizes at 250%. This is about, as I said, getting off, say, 10% of costs, simplifying. So this is a very major upward influence on manufacturers' costs throughout the world. Not everything, because of course there are labour costs too, but it's a very big chunk of costs for some industries. Most industries also have got to pay freight costs, and they also have been going up. Shipping costs have been rising, and at the moment there's a shortage of containers of all things. So, as reported here in the Times of 20th of January. There's also shortages of chips, semiconductors. The German car industry is production's being interrupted because they can't get enough chips, enough semiconductors. So at the moment, in a number of industries, we're seeing shortages, big price rises, major impacts on costs, and this is going to affect inflation in early 2021. This isn't theoretical. This isn't what's going on in asset markets. Will they affect the rest of the economy? This is actually coming through in manufacturers' costs and so on now. The question is, how long does it last? Is it just a blip? Well, let's just think about what's happening at the moment. There still is, in some countries, there are still lockdowns. Output hasn't returned to its normal level. We're going to get in the second and third quarters, as vaccinations take effect, as more people have already been infected and so immunized, you're going to get a bigger bounce back in demand and output than we've seen already. If it were true that companies had very high levels of raw materials, stocks of finished goods, things to meet customer demand and so on, then that would be relatively easy to handle. But this is a chart of what's called the inventory sales ratio at the retail level in the United States. You can see it's the lowest it's been since this started, again, 30 years ago, back in 1992. So what we've got coming up is prospect of an acceleration in the growth of world output. Okay, inventories need to be rebuilt and demand's going to strengthen. What does that mean when we already had this rise in commodity prices? I put it to you that the rise in commodity prices has got further to go. It's the obvious answer. What does that then mean for inflation? The answer, inflation too has to go higher. Now, what are we talking about? And the Institute, back in March, April, May last year, put out forecasts which clearly were regarded as extraordinary at the time, that inflation might head up towards double-digit figures because we'd had money growth rates, in the United States, for example, of 25% or so. Well, we're sort of getting there, aren't we, in some respects? Commodity prices have gone way ahead of that. Yeah, okay, there are labour costs, there are other costs. I think it's reasonable to say that factory gate prices in the United States in the first half of 2021 will be showing annual price gains, say, of 3 to 5%, by the middle of 2021, and that the consumer price index will be moving up towards 2, 3, maybe 3.5%, 4%, these kind of numbers. I don't expect that to be the end of the inflation that's coming up in the next year or two. Let's just be clear, we've got this impact from commodity prices already, and I've just been talking about the implications of the bounce back of output to be expected in the second and third quarters of 2021. Now look, that's all, if you like. There's a certain amount of conjecture there, but much of it's based on just plain fact. I mean, commodity price is a fact. And quite bluntly, many of the economists and so on prognosticating about the medium-term prospect have got it very, very badly wrong. I'm going to be perhaps a bit unkind and mention some people, but I've got an important message when I do this. Here we've got Olivier Blanchard, who was chief economist of the International Monetary Fund in the 7 years to 2015, and a very influential figure in international macroeconomic policy making. He said, the 24th of May 2020, in a column for the Vox CEPR policy portal, I won't go through it all, you can read it if you like. This column argues that it is hard to see strong demand leading to inflation. Oh dear. And then we get Richard Clarida. Now, Richard Clarida is a very important figure in American policymaking. He is vice chairman of the Federal Reserve. And also, let's look at something he said in May last year. In terms of inflation, my projection is for the COVID-19 contagion shock to be disinflationary, not inflationary. And this would be true both in the short term and over the medium term. Assuming this decrease in demand will put downward pressure on core inflation, even into the medium term. Well, Richard Clarida is an influential figure in the Federal Reserve, obviously being a vice chairman, no senior economist there. So I've decided to frame this particular verdict from the Federal Open Market Committee given in early June. Let me just read this. It is, in my view, astonishing, but the forward-looking simulations from the Fed research staff suggested that the committee would have to maintain highly accommodative financial conditions for many years to quicken meaningfully the recovery from the current severe turndown. For many years. Then moving on, it's not just the United States have got these problems with economists saying things that are completely wrong. We've also got, in the UK, we've got Gavin Davis, who used to be with me on the Treasury panel in the early 1990s, in an article in the Financial Times, which is in April, headed, "The deflation threat from the virus will be long-lasting." And indeed, you remember in April last year, we had a 7% jump in the quantity of money broadly defined in the United States in 1 month. 7% in 1 month, therefore annualizing at numbers way up into the 80s, 90s, 100%. And in this very month, we had somebody writing in something called a Foreign Policy, an American magazine, "Terminal deflation is coming." There we are. Now look, this isn't terminal deflation, is it? Obviously, one of the wider issues here is what the hell is going on. Obviously, the view I was expressing was very different at the time, and indeed I had one of these monthly presentations, actually for March, where I said the coronavirus pandemic is inflationary, and I then proceeded to develop that argument over the next few months, and implications of asset prices and so on. And the key to it is the quantity of money and the monetary theory of national income determination. I put the FOMC verdict back in June. I framed that, and I've also framed here something that I said in July last year. When you see these kind of explosive rates of money supply growth, you have got to take on the kind of views I have of how the economy works. You have got to be forecasting rising inflation. So, but let's just be clear that the standard macro model has no role for money in the determination of either national income or the price level at all. That is the problem. That is the background to these fantastic blunders by, on the face of it, authoritative figures. The purpose of the Institute of International Monetary Research is to bring these numbers out into the public debate and to get a better understanding of the relationship between money, national income, and the price level. Well, having got that off my chest, we obviously now have to think a little bit about where we go from here. You might have thought, given the explosion in commodity prices, the shortages of shipping, the shortages of semiconductors. It was giving a kind of message, and this is ahead of the end of the lockdowns, the return to normality as the vaccination programs go ahead and so on. You might have thought that policymakers were thinking, oh God, we got this wrong, we better be careful, we better cut back. The new Treasury Secretary of the United States under President Biden is Janet Yellen, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 2010s. And her view, she's a typical Keynesian economist, she says that actually America must spend big to avoid paying later. This again is something I've taken from the Times of the 20th of January. So there is going to be a $2 trillion fiscal boost, so-called. It's going to be financed to a very large extent from the Federal Reserve and the banking system. That's going to give another upward push to money growth. Current annual growth rate in the United States is about 22%. That kind of growth rate is going to carry on now for another 3-6 months. Let's just look at this chart. This is a chart that I've been making quite a lot of in the last few months. This is the chart of US money growth, 3-month annualized, the green line, and the brown line is the annual rate. You can see that straight line through the 2010s when Janet Yellen was chairman of the Federal Reserve. Mrs. Yellen, the reason that you were successful chairman of the Federal Reserve was precisely this. You had the money growth was stable at a low rate. That's why you were a successful chairman of the Federal Reserve. Nothing to do with fiscal policy, whatever. That was the reason. Now what's happened? Look at it. There'll be 20-25% for, I guess, another 6 months. I don't know what's happening after that because inflation is coming back in a big way. This is the Eurozone. Again, you see that blip upwards in the spring. It's not quite so dramatic, actually, in the Eurozone case. The top 3-month annualized figure is about 20%. The current annual figure is about 11%. Then you've got the UK. Again, we're engaged in the UK in another round of quantitative easing, totally unnecessary, in my view, absolutely stupid. The annual growth rate of broad money up to getting on, it's 14%, will get up to 15%, completely inappropriate and unnecessary, and again, part of the inflationary brew that is now in prospect across the main countries, less so, by the way, in Japan, not true at all in China, and a little bit true in places like India and so on. Where do we go? Well, we will be reporting on these developments as we go through 2021. There is going to be a very big intensifying debate about these topics. We look forward to joining that debate, and I'm sorry that I'm going to win the debate easily. There is going to be a big rise in inflation in 2021, probably rolling on into 2022. Thank you.